Hey everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here, and this is the first episode in a new series I'm starting that's basically something along the lines of thoughts on the various races that make up Total War Warhammer. One of the things I've been doing lately is that I've been kind of playing through as each faction and writing down my thoughts about how I feel about their campaigns, their multiplayer, their aesthetic, how their rosters look, what kind of upgrades they have, what kind of campaign mechanics they have, and basically just making a large list of ideas, thoughts, and conclusions based on my experiences, and of course drawing from my mini books and having played tabletop a lot. I'm someone that manages to I have something to compare Total War Warhammer to, as opposed to a lot of people who may just play the game and just kind of have their feelings on it. I'm someone who's played every one of the factions in tabletop. I've read all of the lore about them, which is something I'm well known for. I've played different video games featuring on the subjects. There's pretty much nothing relating to Warhammer Fantasy I haven't dived into. Board games, tabletop games, role-playing games, the strategy game, painting, building models, customizing, kit bashing models, and all this stuff, and looking at the history of each of the factions. And so what I've decided to do is make a series for each of the factions that's currently playable and talk about basically the things that I have found or discovered, and more importantly, focusing on the future of each of these races. So for the first video, we gotta start with kind of the quote-unquote main characters of the setting, which is the Empire. So without further ado, grab a cup of coffee or tea or whatever it is you drink, and get relaxed, because this is not necessarily going to be a short video. And I'm just going to sort of go through all the things that I have found or think is worth talking about, and I'm hoping that at the end of the video to kind of pose some questions to you guys and get back feedback from y'all. As far as like, what are your thoughts on the various things that I bring up? Do you have your own ideas? Do you have your own problems with the faction? Your own suggested solutions? Because one thing I want to do is that we're kind of entering a weird phase right now in Total War Warhammer where the future is not super well known. The free LC array only goes like 1 or 2 ticks past where we're currently at. Obviously there's more to it, but they've kept it hidden. And on top of that, like, we know eventually there will probably be a Lord DLC, for each of the races. But, what comes after that is we don't know if there's going to be another race for Game 2. We don't know how they're going to do the Lord packs. But most importantly, we don't know how they're going to continue contributing to the Game 1 races. One of my biggest fears about them making Total War Warhammer a trilogy that hasn't really been addressed is that there's this kind of concept where there are some people, and CA seems to have an ear towards these people just because they're very noisy, even though I think they're a minority, who don't want support for Game 1 stuff because they feel like it somehow takes away from Game 2. Like, they feel like once Game 2 is out, you can only do things for Game 2, which is just idiotic, quite frankly. So what I've decided to do is get together a series of ideas for the Game 1 factions starting, and we'll hit Game 2 eventually, but we're going to start with Game 1, about things that could be added that wouldn't necessarily, and they're broken up into different categories about requiring more or less work, or, if they would be free LC or DLC and stuff like that. So because I could ramble forever if I don't get started, let's go ahead and hop into it. And we might come back at the end of the video to talk a little more about stuff like how this could be implemented and the community and stuff like that. I'm probably going to be doing most of this in just one take. So this is just this is a very relaxed format video compared to how I usually do things. Normally I either do a single take on only like really short videos, like maybe a quick battle or something, or a live cast. And then the rest of my stuff is usually like mini takes with a script. This one is kind of a more relaxed format, so this isn't going to be like crazy well edited. I guess is what I'm trying to say. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So the first subject, so we're starting with the Empire, in case I haven't made that clear, and you know, the name of this video will probably be The Future of the Empire. And I'm going to be posting the script from this video, the basic script, on Reddit. And that's probably it. You know, if someone from here wants to post like the video on the forums and have a discussion there, that's great. I don't visit the Total War forums anymore. I just don't. I do visit the subreddit quite a bit though, so that's where I'll post it, with the script included in the comment section. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I want to talk about is thoughts on alterations to current content. So this section is focusing on things that we already have in the game that I think could be altered to make them a little bit better or more viable. And this is only for things, that are currently in the game. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I want to talk about is the steam tank. So the steam tank, originally back in game 1, was a really powerful war machine / chariot hybrid. However, as it's come into game 2, it's become vastly underperforming compared to basically the newer and improved versions of the same device, like the Doom Wheel. In tabletop, the steam tank was kind of like the apex of that design. It was much more reliable and much more powerful than its cousins like the steam tank and the stegadon. They of course had slightly different merits, but the steam tank was like the pinnacle of that invention, but it was also very expensive and you couldn't take very many of them. However, when we look at game 2, we have kind of a different issue of that the steam tank is much less powerful. Its melee defense and weapon strength are so abysmally small compared to its cousins like the Doom Wheel that it's just ridiculous. Like, the melee defense for it is, I think it's like in the teens, but it's absolutely abysmal. So my personal recommendation to kind of bring the steam tank out of the doesn't really get played by anybody list to being more in the modern era is not really to increase like its shooting capabilities, which I think are just fine. I think it's to increase its defensive capabilities, especially in combat. So I think the best way to fix it without getting too overzealous would just be to improve the melee defense to be more on par with the Doom Wheel, and improve its weapon strength as well, so that when it is engaged in combat, like if the steam tank is engaged in combat with a unit, it should be able to like do pretty well at defending itself. It shouldn't be amazing, but it should be atrocious, is I guess what I'm trying to say, in that if it gets stuck in a fight, it should be able to trade pretty efficiently. If it's up against a unit where it can sort of do that ram animation where it kind of backs up and slams into people. But when you compare its attacks to like the Screaming Bell, the Plague Furnace, the Doom Wheel, it's just vastly underperforming, and I think just kind of needs a modern look. So with that, and that's pretty much it. I wouldn't go too much further than that. I think its shooting weapons are perfectly powerful. The cannon and the steam gun. The steam gun's not excessively powerful, but it also has unlimited ammo, which I think is a fair trade. So yeah, that's basically for that. Is just, in my opinion, is to improve the melee defense considerably, and then increasing its weapon strength would also be a good place to look. Next are two units that have a similar issue, which is the handgunners and the Lumen Ark of Hish. So I want to focus on the Lumen Ark second because I've got some more notes on that. Handgunners are a unit that in game 1, you could never find an Empire unit roster without them, most of the time. Like, maybe you wouldn't see them against, like, certain really specific factions. And in game 2, I think there are actually armies like maybe Skaven that they wouldn't be as popular against. But they have a horrible bug right now that's been talked about over and over and over again, where their line of sight and their arc of fire are just bizarre. I have a replay where I literally set up a handgunner unit so that they had a perfect firing arc into an enemy unit across like a little lake. And the enemy flank was completely exposed with no friendly units in the way. All they had to do was shoot across the lake. And I told my handgunners, shoot that unit, and my handgunners proceeded to walk into melee and get killed. So, and you can literally just Google like Total War Warhammer handgunners, and you can find video after video after video right now of Game 2 handgunners just being bugged to hell. And, you know, the game's been out, Game 2's been out now for months, and this has to get fixed. Because it infects more than just the Imperial handgunners as well. It affects Dwarf Thunderers, and it's such an annoying bug for such pivotal units. And it's probably a big reason why a lot of the really powerful armored single entity units like dinosaurs and dragons have become so prominent in Game 2, is that one of their natural counters, which is the gun firing squads, don't work right now, and that has to be a priority on getting fixed. It has to be a priority. And, you know, one of the major things about this video is to organize what the priorities are for each faction and try and put friendly, I cannot express enough, friendly pressure on CA to get going on this and get it done. So moving from the handgunners into, other than that, the handgunners are fine. Like, their damage is great. Like, I think they're fairly well designed. They just have this super bad bug right now where they don't shoot. And if you tell them to shoot at something, they'll just wander into combat and get themselves murdered, and it's so frustrating. It's gotta get fixed, guys. It's gotta get fixed. So let's talk about the Lumen Ark. So the Lumen Ark has almost the exact same problem with the handgunners, in that despite the fact it's a elevated firing platform on a chariot, it has very bizarre line of sight issues, and arc of fire. Which, when I say arc of fire, that means that like you tell it to shoot a unit, and you can draw a line of sight. Like, if you zoom in, you could draw a line from where the weapon fires to the enemy unit uninterrupted. But when you can tell the unit to fire, they get the red indication that says, oh, my firing line of sight is blocked. Or they just like run into combat and get themselves killed. Which is a super frustrating issue that just needs to get taken care of. So the Lumen Ark and the handgunner seem to have a very similar issue on that. However, I do want to talk about one other thing with the Lumen Ark. So currently, the Lumen Ark, not necessarily many people know this, have a passive ability called the Aura of Protection. Right now, it's this pretty terrible ability that gives you 12% magic resistance to all units with, I think, within like 30 or 40 meter radius. That's pretty terrible. And compared to its tabletop counterpart, it's even more terrible, because in tabletop, it's just a straight up 6-up ward save, which, if you're not familiar with tabletop, that basically would translate to having a 12% damage resistance buff. However, CA has been pretty consistent in debuffing ward saves in tabletop to just be like physical resistance, for instance, or lesser damage resistance. So right now, the Lumen Ark of Hysh is a powerful snipe weapon, even though it's very unreliable when it wants to shoot. And it even has a powerful ability where if you get it close to enemy units, the more enemy units it's closer to, if I recall correctly, it can actually absorb your enemies, well, not absorb, but reduce your enemies' winds of magic, which is pretty powerful. However, the problem with the Lumen Ark is that it has a really small number of shots, which, when compiled with the problem of its arc of fire being absolute trash, it has a very limited use and is very expensive. So one of the things that it needs to make it a viable unit, in my opinion, or a fair unit, I should say, is that it's supposed to be a substantial buff slash debuff wagon as a consistent performance, and then it has the powerful spell snipe ability that of course only has like 6 ammunition, you know, so it only fires 6 or 7 times. Granted, each shot can like put a hurt on someone, but it's also possible to like dodge the shot if you're paying attention. It might miss, because even though it's fast and fairly accurate, it can still miss a lot of the time. And basically, right now, it has the problem of you get those 6 or 7 shots if you're lucky, because of the Arc of Fire bug, and then it's done. And you've basically wasted a ton of income, or a ton of your army's value in this unit that just isn't performing well. So, but it has the debuff aura to reduce your enemy's winds of magic, but that requires your Lumen Ark of Hysh to get close to the front lines, close to the enemy line. And right now, it's just not worth it. Because, you know, you want to shoot, and then you have that kind of underwhelming buff of the 12% magic resistance. So what I would recommend to make it much more viable about parking it on that front line, because you don't want to get it in combat, because it has, like, no melee defense, not that great of armor, and it will get chewed up and spit out in combat. What I would recommend doing is changing the Aura of Protection to be more in line with what it's supposed to be, which would be, instead of a 12% magic resistance buff, it should be a 12% physical resistance buff. Because imagine how much more powerful that would be. Like, right now, a Lumen Ark is only dangerous when it has shooting, and once it runs out of ammo, you can literally just ignore it. And it, like, that's really all there is to it. But if they were to make it so that, you know, when it gets close to the front lines, it's draining your winds of magic if it's close enough to enough enemy units, and it's also providing a 12% physical resistance buff to all Empire units within that 30 or 40 meter buff zone. I think it's 30 meters. That would be a huge, nice little buff that you could just park either on the flank where you need additional support, or in the front line to make your halberdiers like able to hold longer, or to make your greatswords able to trade more efficiently with other enemy cav or enemy heavy units. And you can even, and because it's on a chariot, it can even run behind your knight units and try and keep up with them to provide that buff. And it allows for a lot more interesting interplay and makes it a proactive entity on the battlefield, instead of just being this passive thing that sits in the back, shoots artillery, 6 shots with like a 30-second reload time. So, you know, you're lucky if you can get 2 or 3 minutes of value out of it in a battles that usually last anywhere from like 5 if it's really fast to like 15 minutes. So buffing the Lumen Ark of Hysh so that its Aura of Protection is actually good, I think would be a really good way to make it a meaningful contributor to battles, especially in a multiplayer sphere, but even in a single player sphere. 12% magic resistance is just useless, but 12% physical resist, that carries a lot of weight. And if you even wanted to make a damage resist, I think 12% is a little too much without increasing the value of the Lumen Ark of Hysh. So if you wanted to make it a straight ward save, I would recommend making it 6%. On to the next one, we have the cannon. So the Empire Cannon is kind of a weird one compared to its cousins, which are the Warp Lightning Cannon and the Dwarf Cannon. The problem with the Empire Cannon is that it has pretty slow missile speed for a cannon. Its accuracy is really poor, and the rate of fire is not that great. Right now, the Empire Cannon, nobody really takes it unless you take the Hammer of the Witches, which of course comes at the rank 9. It's very underwhelming, and it's just kind of trash compared to other cannons that exist in the game, especially like the Warp Lightning Cannon, which the Warp Lightning Cannon is about 25% more expensive, but it's way more than 25% more efficient. The Warp Lightning Cannon has much faster missiles that are super hard to dodge, even if you're paying close attention. They do magical damage, so they're able to rip through a lot of things that would otherwise block damage. And they just have a lot of other really nasty bonuses. And they also have an elevated platform that they fire from that gives them a better arc of fire, which is super nice. The Empire Cannon, it's pretty expensive for how poorly it performs. Honestly, I think the easiest thing to fix it would be to increase its projectile speed. I mean, if you wanted to make it more accurate, you wouldn't find me complaining. because cannons right now, they're supposed to be anti-large, like anti-monster with their heavy armor piercing and like good single projectile damage, but most cannons in the game are so wildly inaccurate and so slow when it comes to firing, and I mean the actual projectile, that they just can't reliably hit enemy units. Like if you hop into a personal game and you take like a set of cannons from either the Dwarves of the Empire and the Warp Lightning Cannon, and you have them both shoot the same kinds of targets, whether it be flying lords, mounted lords, monsters, or units, the Warp Lightning Cannon disgustingly overperforms. So my recommended changes for the cannon, and this actually kind of goes for the Dwarf Cannon too, is to give both of them back their bonus versus large that they had at the end of game 1. It might not make a huge difference, but it makes enough of a difference to really help encourage focusing on those, like, especially mounted characters, like big dinosaurs and all those things, which the Empire and the Dwarves really struggle with, and help give them that extra oomph they need to be punching holes in large monsters, cavalry units, and flying monsters. For the Empire Cannon in particular, I would recommend either upgrading its accuracy or upgrading its projectile speed, but it needs one of the two. And that leads us into the final unit we're going to talk about in this section, regular unit, which is the Hellstorm Rocket Battery. So this one has always been kind of tricky. The Hellstorm Rocket Battery and its Regiment of Renown version, the Sunmaker, are, most people would agree, absolute trash garbage. Like, the only reason you take them in the Empire campaign is because you have to get 2 of them to unlock the Reikland Runefang quest line, so you can actually get the Reikland Runefang. Other than that, unless you're like just really into them, you probably never take them because they are so bad. And right now, the problem with them is that they fire a ton of shots, but they're wildly inaccurate. They do virtually no armor-piercing damage, and they're just bad. And the Sunmaker's even worse because it fires more projectiles, but it's not anymore. It's barely more accurate due to its 9 chevrons. And instead of having more ammunition that allows it to fire more, it just fires a lot more rounds per volley, but has the same amount of ammunition. So it just runs out of ammo comically fast, which for how expensive it is just absolute garbage. So the thing about it is the Hellstorm Rocket Battery, yes, it's not supposed to be crazy accurate, but the thing about it is that the explosion radius is supposed to be huge. Like, back in the days of tabletop, the Hellstorm Rocket Battery was a rare thing to see, but when you did see it, it could be very effective against armies like Goblins or Skaven, especially Skaven, and other Horde groups, because the projectile, when it would hit the ground, the area of effect was fucking huge. It was like a 5-inch template. It was the largest template in the game, which very few things used. And it wasn't super great because it always scattered, and so it was hard for it to hit accurately. But like, especially if you put an Empire Engineer with it, you could actually get some pretty reliable firings out of it, and it would hurt really bad when it did hit. The thing I would recommend doing for it is, quite frankly, they need to increase its accuracy. Because the thing is, the explosions right now are decently sized, but the thing is, they shouldn't be good against heavily armored targets. Like, I honestly feel like the Hellstorm Rocket Battery should have some of the lowest armor piercing in the game. But it should be fairly accurate, like, when I say fairly accurate, I mean if I were to shoot at a unit that's in a box formation, I should be able to draw like a bit, kind of a, I would probably draw like a 30-meter bubble around them, or maybe I'd say a 30-meter bubble around the center of the unit, and that's vaguely where it should be hitting. So that, like, accurate enough that if you fire at a unit, you're gonna get hits, even, especially because in multiplayer, human players always tend to spread their units out as wide as they can, to just take up more space, because that's kind of advantageous. And because that's become more and more popular, CA has started to design the AI where it does a very similar thing, where it spreads the units out. And so the Hellstorm rocket battery needs to be adjusted so that it compensates for this new playstyle, in that it needs to be more accurate, or the explosions need to be larger. Personally, I think it's better to make it more accurate so it's less prone to abuse with a change. And if you need to reduce the armor piercing so that it, even if it does hit like a bunch on a Black Orc unit, it doesn't like shred them, that's fine. But this is really something that you should be able to point at, like Skaven slaves, or enemy war machine crews, or light cavalry, and ranged units especially, and it should just like obliterate their face with a volley. So the recommended change for me right now is just to notably improve the accuracy. But keeping in mind that if you improve the accuracy enough so that it's reliably hitting stuff, which it should be, that way you're getting something for your value, especially since it's not a super cheap war machine. Mortars are cheaper but are much more accurate. But the Hellstorm rocket battery needs to be notably more accurate, but if you also need to reduce the armor piercing, I honestly think that's okay. So the next thing I want to look at, and we're kind of still in the alteration section, so we're not getting into new content yet. This is just cleaning up content that we already have, is the Empire rule called Hold the Line. So if you're not familiar with it, because maybe you just play multiplayer or you just haven't played Empire in a while, all of the Empire generals and some of the captains have a special rule called Hold the Line. And what Hold the Line does is currently it provides you with a very small leadership buff, like very small. I think it's like maybe +4, and it gives you plus 100% charge resistance. But it's a fairly small area of effect, and it only works if your general stays like practically right on top of your guys, and also obviously if they hold the line. Now that may sound like it makes perfect sense, and there's nothing that really needs to be changed there, but here's my argument. First of all, I think the rule as it currently stands is not that great. Like the charge resistance, it can be good in really specific circumstances, but because of the way the Empire is designed, most Empire generals are not on foot or on horse holding the line. They're usually out like leading charges or scouting terrain on griffins and doing other stuff like that doesn't really allow them to be there. And more importantly, the buff that it does provide is so minuscule that it's hardly noticeable. And most Empire players cannot get away with playing a defensive formation right now, especially with the handgunner bug, because the Empire can't out-trade most other armies in the shooting phase. So that leads to it needing to be changed, in my opinion. But more importantly to me is that the origin of the Hold the Line rule, which is Hold the Line in Tabletop, is a very different rule. So in Tabletop, Hold the Line has nothing to do with charge resistance. It has nothing at all to do with your combat ability. The only thing it affects is leadership. And what it does is it provides a big leadership buff to Empire units that are engaged in close combat and lets them hold the line by not breaking and running, which is an interpretation that I think fits the Empire aesthetic much better and also has a much more practical application. So for that, I would recommend the following change. I would completely get rid of the charge resistance, which quite frankly I don't think the Empire really needs, and I would instead make it a larger leadership buff, like +6 or +8, enough that if an Empire general or Empire captain has the Hold the Line rule and he's like, sitting in a pocket of infantry, that part of the line is much more durable when they get charged by greenskins or undead or what have you, and they're much more likely to stay and keep fighting longer than the other part of the line, because that would actually incentivize Empire players to take generals and captains who are not just flying assassin characters and actually put them in the line. That way they prevent the infantry from buckling. Or even like if they want to go for like a heavy cav army, you could, you would put your Empire general on a horse or your captain on a Pegasus and keep them with your Demigryph knights so that they just hold out a little bit longer to keep trading in those good exchanges. and that would also, more importantly, provide the Empire with little pockets of bonus leadership to help them more against terror-causing units, which right now there are so many terror-causers in the game. And terror is brutal against the Empire, unless, of course, someone's taking Flagellants and, like, Sigmar's Sons. But they're not super popular right now due to debuffs, but I'm not too worried about pure stat line things. So I think changing Hold the Line to be just a larger leadership buff, but removing the charge resistance would be a really good way, especially for Empire players who want more infantry-focused front lines that are just designed to hold. Like, you know, keeping your greatswords engaged longer, or just having your halberdiers just hang in there a little longer. I think this would be the best way to do it. Alright, and the final person for this category that we're going to be looking at is the one and only Balthazar Gil. So, if you're like me and you try to keep your fingers on the pulse of the YouTube community, and Gelt's actually been kind of making a little bit of a comeback in the last few days due to the fact that some people have discovered that if you kind of combo him with Witch Hunters and you just use him to overcast Final Transmutation, he can actually do quite a bit of damage. However, that is a single gimmick, and it's pretty much the only way to make him really good right now. More importantly, however, is the issue that Gelt is not unique. If you look at any other Lord level caster in the game, all of them either have a unique ability or a unique spell, like a bound spell, that really sets them apart from other wizards and makes them feel powerful. Mazdamundi has 2 powerful bound spells, one of which is completely unique to him. Wurzak has the ability to pin people in place, and he can also get a bound spell if you put on his mask. His Squiggly Beast also does something, though I can't remember it off the top of my head. You have Morathi, who has some really nice combat abilities, and she also has her Enchanting Beauty passive, which has some really nice traits. And she has like a mixed lore that makes her interesting. Manfred von Karstein has 2 lores of magic and some really powerful items. Balthazar Gelt is literally a wizard lord with pretty underwhelming stats. They didn't give him bonus armor or anything. He doesn't have any bonus like missile resistance or magic resistance to make him more survivable. They, upgraded quote unquote him to be able to be put on a horse, in a barded warhorse, which gives you some options. But he's just really bland. His campaign has gotten a lot better in that he has some really useful campaign abilities. But when it comes to battles, either in campaign or in multiplayer, or just skirmish or whatever, Balthazar Gelt is easily the most underwhelming and boring casting lord in the entire game. Even Kimmler has some really badass in-battle abilities now. So, what do we do with Gelt then? My recommended change is to do a nice little easy thing, which is to give him a unique spell. So one thing that's not necessarily well known by the Total War community is that each of the lores of magic, all of them, with very minor exception, like one of the Skaven lores and like the Beastman lore, but like with very minor exception, every single lore in Warhammer Fantasy has 7 spells. They had what's called a signature spell, which is a spell that pretty much every wizard would have, and then they had 6 larger spells. Now, Total War only has 6 spells per lore. So one spell from every lore, for the most part, got kicked out. So, now that may have you wondering, okay, so where am I going with this? And where I'm going with this is to give Gelt as a bound spell the one spell missing from the Lore of Metal, which is actually quite powerful. It's called the Enchanted Blades of Iban, and it's very straightforward. It basically gives you a buff to your melee and range to hit chance, and gives you the magical damage and armor piercing trait in tabletop. So basically, it would be very similar to the Hand of Glory that we have now in Total War Warhammer, where it gives you, a bonus to your melee attack and reload skill. But it would be a little more powerful than that. So what I would recommend is making it a bound spell that Gelt has with 2 or 3 max casts, because if there's one thing we've started to learn lately, it's that any ability that doesn't cost magic probably needs to have a maximum amount of uses. And the Enchanted Blade of Ivan should do the following. He should only be able to cast it on a single unit, and whatever unit he casts it on gets plus melee attack, plus reload skill, plus percentage armor piercing damage, and grants the magical damage keyword or trigger. So it would be like, hey, my greatswords are exchanging with those savage orcs, so I cast Enchanted Blades on them, and it gives them plus melee attack, increases their armor piercing damage, and gives them magical damage. That's a great buff. Or hey, I'm going to use this on my crossbowmen, so now my crossbowmen have a faster reload rate, or it could increase their accuracy, but accuracy is a rare trait to see upgraded, so I usually just put it in as reload skill. But it increases their shooting ability, also increases their armor piercing damage, and grants magical damage, which could be super useful at shooting down certain monsters, certain characters, or if you're fighting like savage orcs, that could be a really nice niche buff. Or, if you're fighting a vampire count player and they throw in their Hex Raids or Karen Raids, you could pop that on your Knight unit, your Reiksguard unit, so they could come slamming in with those magical attacks and just reap a good tally. But it would really set Gelt apart from all the other metal wizards in the game, which right now, the only difference between Gelt and like a Chaos Sorcerer Lord, for instance, is that Gelt is worse in combat. It does not have as powerful of a mount, where his best mount is a Pegasus, Quicksilver, and the Chaos Sorcerer Lord can ride a fucking dragon. And then, but he has the Staff of Volans, which, gives him more magic. Woo, that's super exciting. Not. So I would definitely advocate very hard for getting the Enchanted Blades of Iban as the kind of unique gimmick that Gelt brings to the table, which from the amount of times we're seeing it done now, it seems that implementing something like that kind of bounce spell ability is not terribly difficult. It's also, and especially if we use something like Hand of Glory and just add to it a little bit, should be a fairly straightforward upgrade to do that shouldn't be too difficult, and it would really set Gelt apart from other wizards and really establish him as a really powerful support character, which the lore of metal is kind of an interesting mix of support spells, debuff spells, and then very conditional damage spells. But I think it would be a really nice way to kind of give him a little tip of the hat, especially with people kind of wanting to use like the Final Transmutation spell, which if you overcast costs like 28 winds of magic. Giving him like the Enchanted Blades of Iban would be a really good way to still allow him to perform even when the winds of magic aren't necessarily high. So with that, and already having talked for almost 40 minutes, we're finished with the alterations on current content part of this video, and now we're going to go ahead and move into the next section. So let's go ahead and get on that. Alright, so the next section can easily turn into a bit of a slog, so we're not going to get too in-depth other than me talk very briefly about each of my recommendations. So the next thing we have coming up is what I call the Free LC Upgrades section. And this is quite literally things that would be a minor change to the game that would add value to it, like unique buildings, upgrading the Empire Tech Tree, adding in like one Free LC Legendary Lord who would be a simpler upgrade, and things like that. We do have a section coming up later on that I call DLC, which is much bigger changes, but this one's rather long, so we're just going to kind of bull into it. So, starting with a Legendary Lord, the most obvious choice would be Boris Todbringer. He already has a unique model in the game, he already has unique voice lines as a faction leader. Basically, the only thing missing is that he's not playable. He needs his items to be a little bit, tweaked, and he needs a quest battle according to the laws that seemingly govern what makes a Legendary Lord. Obviously, I would not recommend more than one quest battle for him, just because it seems like they take a lot of work, and I don't really want CA to look at these as like major investments. I want them to look at these as small upgrades that provide a big bang for a little buck. So Boris Todbringer, the only thing that he really needs to have done is that The Midland Runefang, which is his weapon, and the Talisman of Ulrich just need to kind of be upgrading to their own items. Right now they've been fused into one item, and it could be kept that way, because the Midland Runefang is not what actually gives Boris his regeneration. It's the Talisman of Ulrich that gives him the ability to regenerate. That being said, if they decided they wanted to make these two items into like skill points, like the Bretonnian lords have, where you'll notice that like Lumen Ark and the Fey Enchantress, many of their magic items just became skills, I'm honestly okay with that. As long as they're represented in the game, I don't care as much how they're represented. I like quest battles a lot, but they seem to be pretty difficult to implement because we're kind of seeing less of them per character. To the point where items are kind of just getting left out of the game, which that's really not okay. So I would rather just see the item represented in the game as a way of providing buffs or abilities, but not if it's like gonna take that much work. So that's really all that needs to be done for Boris. Obviously he would start in Mordheim. The only other thing I would add to him is a unique unit to come alongside him that would be available to both him and the Empire, but it would require you to capture the city of Mordheim to use it, which we'll talk about later in the DLC section. So the next thing for the pure free DLC section is the tech tree. The Empire tech tree is pretty straightforward. It's pretty awesome right now. It doesn't really need any alterations in my opinion, but it could use an addition, because right now it's uneven. It's got like, if you look at it, there's like a blank space where there should be 3 techs, it feels like, and it looks a little awkward. So I would recommend filling in that space. And the way I would recommend doing it is that if you look at the Empire tech tree, each one of the squares of 3 is unlocked by building either a military structure or a military support structure or a advanced military support structure. And every single building in the game for the Empire has an associated tech except for one in those 2 branch trees, which is the wizard recruitment buildings. So the colleges of magic if you're in Altdorf, and then like the wizard conclave and wizard tower, whatever they're called, if you're in any other city. So I would recommend adding 3 techs that are based on the wizards building train, and these are my recommendations. The first one should just be plus 10% campaign movement for all armies to represent, like, you know, having like shadow steeds conjured by the shadow wizards that allow armies to move faster, and like the jade wizards using their life magic to clear forest paths so the armies can move faster across the land. The next one I would recommend, the next tech should be plus 2 to all recruited wizard ranks across the map, which if you were to combo with the Altdorf Colleges of Magic and Balthazar Gil's abilities, you could get some really powerful wizards recruited, like right out of recruitment, which would be really nice. And of course, this would basically represent that, you know, with this tech, you'd be gathering conclaves of wizards, which allows all these young acolytes to find true masters in the colleges or wizard towers who can teach them more efficiently how to wield the winds of magic. So you're getting more powerful casters faster. And the final one that I would have would be plus 5 to 10, somewhere in that ballpark, percent hero success chance. And this could represent how having all these wizards allows the Empire to forge enchanted weapons and armor created by the Wizard Lords, or at least enchanted by the Wizard Lords, so that your agents have more powerful tools for their success. Because the Empire has a ton of heroes, and, you know, one thing they don't have, which is kind of surprising compared to other factions, is the Empire does not have a hero success chance tech, which is actually very common for most other factions. So I think tying it to the wizard building would be really nice, and that would give you 3 techs, and the tech tree would look really nice, and it would be symmetrical, which would make me happy. So the next section is a bit of a lore dump. Essentially, I basically went through the entire Empire and I looked at every province, because the whole point of the Empire campaign is it's kind of split up into 3 phases essentially. The first phase is uniting your province, the second phase is uniting the Empire, and the last phase is running out and like taking over the world. So the Empire should be important to Imperial players. You should have like kind of little rewards to encourage you to take over the entirety of the Empire and claim each province beyond just, needing it for your victory condition. So I think the easiest way to do that is to have at least one unique building per Imperial province. So basically, I have gone through, and for every single province that did not have one, I have gathered a few options. So the first we're going to be looking at is Averheim, which is the capital of Averland. And this is the province of the Mad Count Marius Leitdorf, and there are two options. The first is the Averburg, and the Averburg is basically this colossal castle that was built by the very first Elector Count of Averland, Sigurd, who was friends with Sigmar. And it basically is this colossal, monumental fortress that has all these powerful relics buried deep within. And it has basically been fortified non-stop since the founding of the Empire, and has tons of resources, tons of soldiers. And Marius Leitdorf in particular was really paranoid and thought the end times was coming, which he was kind of right. And so he brutally overstocked the Averburg, as we discovered in the end times. So to represent that, the Averburg would be a unique building that you could build that I would say could have the following effects. It should increase the amount of time, siege time, it takes to capture Averheim. So add 3 turns to your siege defense. It should increase ammunition and leadership for the defenders. And what I would also recommend is that it should maybe reduce local upkeep due to having tons of supplies to feed and keep your soldiers with. And that could be kind of a nice bonus to basically make it a defensive bulwark, especially since Averheim is kind of the first major fortress that any invading force from the south has to go through to get to you. Whether it be the border princes getting a little too handsy, or the greenskins having a wall, or the Tomb Kings coming up, or whatever. So that would be a really nice option, would be to have the Averburg basically make Averheim into a pillar of defense. And of course that also works against the vampire counts, who are likely to try and attack it from the east as well. The other option is the Pillar of Skulls. So the Pillar of Skulls is a very famous monument that was built in Averheim after Gorbad Ironclaw passed through. Which, if you don't know who Gorbad Ironclaw is, he's one of the biggest, baddest orcs to have ever lived. He was a huge deal. He wiped out an entire Imperial province. Because there used to be 12 provinces, and now there's only 10. And Gorbad Ironclaw is responsible for one of them going down. When he attacked the city of Averheim, basically they were surrounded. The defenders were forced further and further and further into their city, up it, towards the Averburg, and they managed to just hold. And it was just a crazy battle of sheer determination. And basically Gorbad got really bored with laying siege to these humans who just wouldn't give up and wouldn't come out of their city. So he kept pushing them until a certain point where they refused to give any more ground, and he basically decided, all right, we've had our fill. We've beaten these guys enough. Let's go find a real fight. And he retreated and went off to go rampage somewhere else. And so what Averheim, the survivors of the battle, did was that, using all of the skulls of the orcs who had attacked the city, they built this really big monument of orc skulls at the point where the Averlanders basically fought their last stand, as a symbol of this is the closest that any enemy has gotten to taking our city, and no one will ever make it past this point. And basically it's a huge inspirational monument, especially for when Averheim is under attack, in that it really reminds the defenders that no one has ever taken this city and no one ever will. So the way I would do it is I would have it simply provide a bonus to either the entire province or the entire Empire faction's leadership, as the soldiers are able to pass through Averland and see that great monument as a testament to the tenacity and the determination of the Empire to survive despite all odds. Which I think would be a really fun lore tidbit and also a really unique building that could have some good buffs. Next, moving up to the Imperial province of Hochland, we turn our attention to Hergig. The Brass Keep would actually make a pretty cool, unique settlement, but it's only supposed to belong to Chaos, so there's not really an Imperial thing you can build there. Like, if the Warriors of Chaos were able to take settlements, I would say the Brass Keep would be where they could build something unique, so we can't really look at that. So, when it comes to Hergig, there is one particularly famous set of structures, I should say, to look at, which is called the Shrines of the Irebox. So, on one of the side roads leading to Hergig, but very close to Hergig, is the village of Gruden, which is home to the Arbok family. So this family of Imperial citizens, they're basically insanely devout to the entire Empire pantheon, and they have stupid amounts of wealth. They're kind of like the Bill Gates of the province of Hochland. And what they've decided to do with their wealth is that they've spared no expense in creating these amazing shrines to each of the Imperial gods. The shrines belong to Sigmar, Tal, and Raya being the most large and amazing. But these are all like very gorgeous with like precious gemstones and trimmed with gold leaf and beautiful stained glass windows imported from all over the world and built with like this really rare marble, and like they're just super gorgeous. And like the area that these were built in are actually super affluent, because unlike many areas where like someone builds something decadent and it maybe hurts the local populace, this helps the local populace because the Irebox actually employ all of the local villagers around Hergig to help take care of these shrines and basically maintain them. So it's this huge source of income as well for Hergig, because so many pilgrims or people make pilgrimages, rather, not necessarily pilgrims, but people travel from all over the Empire to come see these amazing, gorgeous shrines and pay their respects to the Imperial Pantheon. And such is the power of faith in this area, rumoredly, of course, that when there was a massive series of invasions into Hochland, while many local areas were destroyed and many cities were sacked and such like that, the village of Gruden, which is very close to Hergig, was completely left untouched, because the forces of chaos were like seemingly blind to where this thing is. So like they walked right past it without even noticing it was there. So the village was left completely untouched in every invasion. It's never been successfully attacked. And it's believed it's because the Imperial gods look so favorably upon these lavish gifts and worship. So I would recommend having it being a unique building you can set up in Hergig. And it should be probably one of the most expensive structures to build in the entire Imperial building chain. However, if you do build it, it should provide a huge bonus to untainted corruption in the province, increase local income, and reduce enemy armies' campaign movement through the province of Hochland. I think that would add like a really nice, interesting series of buffs, especially since Hochland is a very popular spot for enemy forces to travel to and fro, whether it be vampires, the Warriors of Chaos, Norskins, or other such nefarious foes, just because Hochland is kind of one of the main ways to get from the eastern side of the Empire to the west without having to cross any rivers. So that would provide like a really nice series of buffs, and the big untainted bonus would help a lot, especially since poor old Ostermark and Osland tend to get absolutely smacked by chaos. Next, we turn our attention to the province of Stirling, which is of course neighbor to Sylvania, and often feels the wrath of the vampire counts, but that's not who we're looking at today. Most importantly, Stirling has the Moot as one of its settlements. And the Moot is of course one of the most important places in the Empire, because A, it's the Empire's breadbasket, and B, that's where all the halflings live. And it feels so wrong that an entire race in the Warhammer Fantasy universe is not even given a nod to in the Moot. Like, they have a settlement, but there's no unique building to, like, honor them, you know, or make note of their existence. And they're pretty important, honestly. So what I would recommend is for there to be a unique building in the Moot settlement that very obviously tips its hat to the halflings. And my recommended one is a very particularly famous place in the Moot called Greenleaf's Valley. And Greenleaf's Valley is a part of the Moot where it's basically the most famous set of tobacco fields in the old world. Which one of the biggest exports of the halflings is, of course, tobacco. And it's so amazingly high quality that buyers come from Kislev, the Border Princes, Bretonia, Estalia, Tilia, just to get their hands on this tobacco. So it's a major export for the halflings. And the halflings, of course, being the clever little bastards that they are, have even started sending out individual halfling merchants who carry, like, sample sizes with them to try, and they travel all over the world to try and get people hooked on halfling, really quality halfling tobacco, so that they'll order from the Greenleaf's Valley and the halflings can just rake in all that sweet money. So I would have it be a structure that you can build there. And for the attributes, it should provide a large boost to trade and local income for the Moot. I would also have it add a public order bonus for the Stirling province due to, you know, having some good tobacco to keep everybody calm and just to represent the overall, you know, pretty chill nature of the halflings when they're not being all vulgar. But I think that would be a really fun and interesting way to reward the player for capturing Stirling, especially since you kind of have to fight the vampire counts for it and you have to defend it from the south. However, if they didn't want to do that, another option is a particularly famous inn in the Moot, which is called the Three Smoke Rings, which is a halfling inn, and it's the official trade market hub for tobacco in the whole of the Moot. So it's the most famous location in the Moot when it comes to trading. However, it has a downside in that the halflings there may or may not have started worshipping as some kind of dark, horrible entity that they may or may not sacrifice travelers to in like bloody rituals in order to get better harvests. You didn't hear it from me though. But that would be kind of a funny way if they wanted to like have a more interesting building where like it also increases your local and trade income and maybe even increases your public order, but it like provides like chaos corruption. That could be kind of fun. The next province we're traveling to is the eastern province of Ostermark. Now, Ostermark has a very, very famous former city in it, very, very close to the city of Essen. And that is the former capital of the province, which is a little city once known as Mordheim. So my recommendation would be for the player in the city of Essen to be able to build the ruins of Mordheim, which Mordheim was once one of the most affluent and powerful cities in the Empire until they basically got too greedy, too sinful, supposedly, and a giant comet that many believe to be the Wrath of Sigmar incarnate came falling out of the sky and just slammed right into the city and just killed tons of people, and it was made purely out of warpstone. So it ended up opening like this horrible series of like chaos radiations across the city that warped it, tainted it, and people from all over sent in war bands into the city to try and collect as much warpstone as possible, because warpstone is a very powerful alchemical substance that wizards, alchemists, healers, engineers, everybody wants, because it provides so many unique benefits. And it was a major event in the early days of the Empire, and many people competed over the ruins of Mordheim for the rich source of warpstone, including Vlad von Karstein prior to the Vampire Wars. That's actually where he got most of the warpstone he needed to start the Vampire Wars. Of course, the city was eventually razed completely to the ground by Magnus the Pious, who decided he had had enough. But the city still exists to this day in some capacity, and if someone were to go in and like build a settlement on top of it to revitalize it, they could make quite a bit of money. So my recommendation for the attributes, if you built the ruins of Mordheim, would be to receive a pretty major income increase. Like I'm talking like 300 to 600 gold. And it increases the Winds of Magic faction wide as you're able to harness Warpstone and all of your wizards get more powerful. But it should increase the chaos corruption in that province by a pretty decent margin to make it kind of a high risk, high reward building that you can build in that settlement. And also due to its history of being something that's harvested by multiple races, I would have the Ruins of Mordheim be a special building that's available to be built by the Empire, Bretonnia, Skaven, the Vampire Counts, and that's probably it. I guess you could also include Norska in that, but I would probably just have it be those four, because those four were they were all fairly major competitors in the Mordheim crisis when it came to just trying to get lots of Warpstone for themselves. And I don't even know about the Bretonians, but definitely the Skaven, Vampire Counts, and Empire. Definitely those three. Next, we need to travel to the province of Ostland, which is the province that unfortunately tends to hold off chaos a lot and gets stuck doing that. And this is actually the last one. So there are some options here, but both of them belong in Wolfenburg, which is the capital of the often beleaguered province. This city, of course, is the first major imperial city that the forces of chaos usually end up fighting against. They, of course, have the infamous border forts that chaos often struggles to get through, and they all tend to have to fight through Kislev as well to reach this far south. But we're just looking at what the Empire can build here, so that it essentially needs to be something that represents Wolfenburg or Ostland's dedication to holding off the forces of chaos. And here are the two things I've managed to dig up. The first is the Order of the Silver Hammer, or essentially like a particularly that's what I would call it, but it's the Order of the Silver Hammer is has a very strong presence in Wolfenburg for various reasons. First of all is that Wolfenburg, the city, is actually named after Wolfgard Krieger, who was a friend of Sigmar's that Sigmar appointed to defend the Emperor against magic. And he founded this Order of the Silver Hammer, which nowadays is known as the Order of Witch Hunters. Or at least they make up a massive part of it. And this would make, especially with the end times coming on, it would make a lot of sense for the Witch Hunters to have an increased presence, or the Order of the Silver Hammer to be returning to their roots and have a very powerful presence in Wolfenburg to basically push back the tides of destruction. So for attributes, when it comes to the Order of the Silver Hammer, I would have it be a unique building that would allow you to recruit Witch Hunters without having to build the Sigmarite chapels buildings. In addition, it should provide a recruitment rank bonus, either faction-wide or locally, for Witch Hunters. And finally, it should provide a provincial bonus to Ostland for hero success chance and untainted corruption. So it should reduce corruption, especially chaos corruption, and increase the chance of your Witch Hunters, for instance, to pull off successful assassinations or block heroes or block armies and stuff like that while in the province, which could be a really nice way to help the player or the AI when controlling Ostland hold back the tides of chaos and punish them for trying to sneak through Wolfenburg. The other option I have for Wolfenburg is Castle Volganov. So Castle Volganov was a very, very famous castle that featured heavily in 8th edition, in the start of 8th edition, because it was basically the setting stage for the largest battle in the 8th edition Big Red Book, which is a very large book that contains all the rules and a bunch of lore and a bunch of other stuff. And in the back of the book is the largest battle they fought leading up to the publication of that book, which was the battle for Castle Volganov. It was destroyed during that battle, but fortunately for us, Mortkin the Black Iron Reaver has not attacked Castle Volganov yet. by the time Total War Warhammer is taking place, which is important. That's why like people like Azhag are still alive, because according to the timeline, he hasn't died yet, because it's only the Imperial year of like 2502. So Castle Volkanov is the most well-defended place in the province, and it guards one of the only ways to the city of Wolfenburg for those that wish to invade the Empire. So this castle is a hugely important defensive structure that has held back the tides of destruction that have tried to attack the Empire time and time and time again. Of course, like I said, it was destroyed by the Fell Legion of Mordkin the Black Iron Reaver, but that hasn't happened yet, so we're all good. When it comes to the attributes for Castle Volkanov, I would have it do the following things. It could probably replace the actual like siege structure, or like the siege building tree, like the 3 walls, or it could be in addition to it. But what I would have that it would provide as a bonus is that it should add more elite units to the garrison, like Great Swords or Reichsguard. In addition, it should provide a bonus to siege time for the defenders, and I would also have it increase their leadership, melee attack, and probably either ammunition or melee defense. But it should basically just make if you have like a 20 stack sitting in this building, or even just the full power garrison, it should be really hard to get through it. It should be a very powerful defense. So hopefully some of those you find at least inspiring, if not interesting. And let's just kind of keep on chugging. So the next section we have are campaign mechanics. So for campaign mechanics, the Empire doesn't have any right now. The only thing the Empire has that I would describe as a campaign mechanic are the offices. Which the offices are not really that interesting. Unlike the Wood Elf offices, none of them provide any actual like new abilities. Where like the Wood Elf offices give you the ability to trade, or the ability to call the Wild Hunt, or the ability to like use all sorts of crazy other little things, which are all very neat and thematic. The Empire's is pretty bleh. It's kind of like, oh, you get this bonus, or when you have Reichsguard in this dude's army, he gets a bonus, and stuff like that. Those definitely should be buffed or changed a little bit. I would say buffed. I would just buff them all to make them to make you really consider who you're putting in what role, because the buffs it provides are much more notable. But we're not going to focus too much on that. What I'm going to focus on is adding an entirely new mechanic, which is a Confederation mechanic. And the reason is because the Empire essentially, like I said earlier, has 3 main phases to their campaign. The early game is conquering your province, the mid game is trying to conquer the Empire, and then the late game is trying to conquer the world. And usually in the middle of the mid game is when chaos usually comes and kicks you in the face. So, however, the Empire really takes off the ground and it becomes powerful and has a lot of really interesting options once you have the entire Empire under your thumb. And right now, it's kind of hard to do, because the Confederation system in Total War Warhammer is pretty underwhelming. And you often need a buff of some sort to help you confederate the AI, because the AI hates confederating with people. And Confederation is also extremely punishing. With the exception of, I think Bretonia is the only race that isn't punished for confederating. But, in Bretonia, you have, a whole tech tree that gives you diplomatic bonuses and allows you to confederate with other Bretonian kingdoms, and it's awesome. Or the Norskins, of course, have the ability to kill the enemy faction leader, which allows them to confederate, which is awesome. The Empire is another race that should really have something similar to that, and this is my recommendation. The best way I could think to implement it would be to give the Empire players a table, so opening a little mini screen, so the mortuary cult table, for instance. But it should be an Empire table that allows the Empire player to select an AI Empire faction, and then they would be given a event, dilemma, or quest that would allow them to increase their diplomacy with that Imperial faction and make it more likely to get like a certain deal, like trade or non-aggression or defensive alliance, and of course work up to confederating with them. And good examples with that, of if it was like a quest, for instance, I could see it being like, like the Emperor of Ostermark has fallen on hard times, and you would really gain his support if you gave him 2,000 gold before this particular turn. Or it could be something like, the Elector Count of Stirling is having problems with the undead raging through his lands. Like, maybe help him get his province down to a certain corruption level, or maybe attack, maybe have an agent perform a successful action against a Vampire Count army or settlement. Or maybe the Elector Count of Nordland has been raided by Norskins and wishes to get revenge. Go raise a Norskin settlement. Things that encourage you to get out and do things to help the other Imperial provinces. Another interesting thing, and so that would be like the quest example. Now, another cool thing would be like if you had dilemmas. So like if it would pull up a chart, kind of like it does for the High Elves, where it's like, all right, here's an event that happened. What's your response to this as the Emperor, or as whatever role whatever character you're playing? How will you handle this event? And maybe if you pick one option, you don't gain, maybe you like don't gain any diplomacy, but you might get an item out of it. Or maybe like you can say, okay, Nordland and Ostermark, or Nordland and Ostland are having an argument over resources. Who are you going to help out and like declare, no, this is their rightful like forest area for them to harvest. And you say, oh, I'm going to support Ostland on this. So maybe you get like plus 30 diplomacy with Ostland, but minus 30 diplomacy with Nordland. That way you kind of have to like balance the scales of trying to figure out, okay, when am I going to support faction A so that I can try and confederate with them more quickly? And when am I going to ignore this other one? Or maybe this is a province that I want to try and take by force, so it's okay if they hate me, because maybe I'm trying to encourage them to declare war on me or what have you. And it would just make it a lot more interesting overall. Now, on top of that, I would actually encourage the chart to not just have Imperial AI factions, but also just the other human factions. So like Kislev, Bretonnia, Marienburg, the Southern Realms, the New World colonies, Sudenburg, etc., etc. And the reason is because the Empire is supposed to be the greatest statesman in the world. One of the things that the Empire is super famous for is the ability to forge alliances with even the most unlikely of races or people. And that's especially true when it comes to the realms of men. And the most important thing is that by having this table include other AI human factions, it would allow the table to still be useful even once you conquer the entirety of the Empire. And that's pretty much the best idea I've had for that, at least at the moment. Obviously, this is one of those areas where I could really use input from other folks that would allow for more ideas about how the Empire could have unique mechanics, especially when it comes to improving and developing the offices for the Empire, like the Reichsmarshal and the Supreme Patriarch, Archlector and such. Because right now they're pretty meh. And they provide little bonuses, but like it'd be nice if they provided like an army ability or a unique career or a unique access to an event or something. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and move on to the next section, which is unique start positions. This will be a pretty short section, thank God, right? Where we're just going to talk about moving Balthazar Gelt and Volkmar the Grim. Because one of the things that's been growing very much in popularity lately has been the request and ideal that every single legendary lord should have a unique start position, a unique faction, and that allowing players to have more co-op options and stuff like that. Currently, the Empire is rather unique in a bad way in that all of its legendary lords are in one place, which is, of course, Altdorf. So here I have some recommendations about where to move them. The first is Balthazar Gelt. The Supreme Patriarch, obviously he makes a lot of sense for Altdorf, simply because, he's the Supreme Patriarch, therefore he reigns at the Colleges of Magic, which is a unique building that the Altdorf city has. However, When it comes to moving him somewhere else, I think there are a couple of good options. The first thing that comes to mind is having him take over the faction of Wizenland and put him in Nuln. The reason I say this is that would allow Gelt to basically focus more on his relationship with the various engineering and gunnery schools of the Empire. Gelt is someone who has worked very closely with those different groups, and Gelt was one of the biggest proponents of expanding the colleges of magic to be influential outside of just the colleges, and working with other organizations to make people more accepting of wizards. He's a huge proponent of that. Granted, he tends to do it for his own personal means, but it has resulted in some really nice benefits for other organizations, such as the engineering college and the gunnery schools, when he, for instance, invented a new form of black powder that was more stable and easier to produce. And he also has helped with numerous inventions and turns his engineering mind and his control over the lore of metal to greater help forging new weapons of war and things like that. So the closest thing to having that would be to put him in Nuln, especially since Balthazar Gelt, when it comes to like special characters, is the closest thing you'll ever get to like an engineering special character for the Empire. On top of that, the reason I say Nuln and not one of the other major capitals is because Nuln does not have a character in the Empire Army book who makes for a good kind of traditional lord. The Countess isn't really a formidable warrior. She's much more of a political figure that tends to fight from behind the shadows. And of course, there are some characters that were in Nuln during the Tarmacon crisis, but Tarmacon hasn't occurred yet. And a lot of the characters who were in the Tarmacon crisis, some of them were... they're not super well established members of the Empire, and they were just kind of fleeting characters for a single campaign that never showed up again and didn't really have a major impact on the overall narrative of the Empire, other than being in that particular area for the Tarmacon crisis. On top of that, of course, Gelt would be good in Nuln because it would keep him close enough to Altdorf that once you were to forge an alliance with Reichland, you could build the colleges of magic and be able to stack that crazy awesome bonus he has of recruiting wizards with the colleges of magic bonus to recruiting wizards. But I actually find I don't think he needs to be in Altdorf, just because Gelt doesn't really have a huge tie to Altdorf or Reichland outside of the fact that the colleges are there. Other than that, like, he's not from there. He's not particularly well known for only defending Reichland. He travels all over the Empire doing stuff. So it makes sense to move him to where he's needed most at any given time. The second legendary lord we're going to look at, of course, is Volkmar the Grim. So the Grand Theogenes, I actually think, is quite a bit easier than poor old Gelt, because the Cathedral of Sigmar in Altdorf isn't actually a unique structure in Total War Warhammer. You have like the Imperial Palace, and the Colleges of Magic. So there's nothing really keeping Volkmar the Grim in Altdorf, and much like Gelt, he usually doesn't hang out in Altdorf like 100% of the time. He is often out fighting somewhere else in the Empire, leading from the front lines, purging evil wherever he finds it. He very frequently is not there, leading out raids and other marches against the various enemies of the Empire. So when it comes to that, I would suggest moving him to represent Volkmar going on another one of his crusades. And there are probably two good options here, because ultimately Volkmar hates the enemies of the Empire, especially the more corrupting ones, which are the Vampire Counts and the Warriors of Chaos. So because he hates them both fairly equally, I would recommend splitting the difference and putting him in one of the two capitals that's kind of halfway between Sylvania and Norska, which is to say I would either put him in Beckhofen or Wolfenburg to basically represent him having that start position where you can either lead the crusade north against the Norskins and the Warriors of Chaos, or you can lead the crusade south and go after the vampire counts. In addition, this would actually be a really different starting position than the other Imperial Lords, as it would give you a northeastern start position, and you would have a fairly different campaign. You know, you're not going to be dealing with Bretonnia or Marienburg, but you're going to be dealing with Kislev, the Norskins, and you're going to be dealing with different dwarf factions. You're also going to have a much stronger greenskin presence due to being closer to the mountains. So I think that would actually make for a much more interesting start position for him. And with some of the new buildings that I suggested earlier in the video, Volkmar could fit in really well in some of these areas. So hopefully those make sense. If y'all have any recommendations on where they should move to, I'd be glad to hear it. Alright, so on to the next session. Let's talk about rights. I think rights are actually probably the most difficult part of this video, and that's because rights are so open-ended, it's kind of ridiculous, but they also need to be truly unique. You can't just, you know, pull out some random nonsense, and because rights are supposed to kind of strike at the core of the faction and represent an interesting aspect of them. So I kind of thought for a while about the best way to have rights for the Empire. You know, I thought about maybe doing a Crusader thing, involving the knightly orders, or maybe focusing on like the various different like higher up tiers of the Empire, or maybe something to do with the Elector counts. But eventually I finally settled on something, and that is that the Empire actually doesn't have very many references to the Imperial Pantheon outside of like Sigmar, which contrary to the way the game may focus it, the Pantheon of the Empire is fairly large. It's not the largest in the world by any means, but it's one of the bigger ones. It's decent size. It's a medium. But most of the Imperial gods are very, very important and have major roles in Imperial society. But you wouldn't guess that from playing Total War Warhammer. You might get the conclusion, and, you know, obviously so, that Sigmar is like the major god of the Pantheon, which is not necessarily true. He's only the major god of the Pantheon in specific areas. So with that in mind, I came up with the following 4 rites. They're called liturgies, because they're meant to represent like the religious songs or prayers to invoke these gods of the Empire and bring down their blessings for various buffs. So the first one I have is the Liturgy of Mor. Mor is the god of death and dreams, and what I recommended for him is that essentially you'd make your prayer to him for him to provide the following blessings. He would increase untainted corruption, as Mor being the god of death and dreams, he hates things that mess with the cycle of death in the Empire. There is no god that hates the vampire counts more than Mor does. Mor despises the undead because they're basically people that are robbed from his realm, and he's very protective of the dead. And so I would have him give increased corruption. I would have him increase all armies' ambush defense chance to represent him sending dreams to your generals and commanders and warning them of various aspects of what's going on and such. On top of that, I would have his final one be a rather unique one, which is I would have, if you do the Liturgy of Mor, it reduces all of the corpse numbers in regions that you own to 0. And what I mean by that is whenever you fight a battle on the campaign map, usually after the battle there's like a pile of just stuff that represents the field you just fought on, and it'll be like the battle of such and such was fought here, and this is how many people died here. And the vampire counts are able to go into these zones and use the raise dead mechanic to make themselves more powerful by feeding off these battlefields. And currently, that's a mechanic that no other faction can combat. Basically, if you fight a bunch in your land and the vampire counts decide to attack you, you can kind of be SOL because the AI just generates a ton of armies. This would actually allow the Empire uniquely to combat the vampire counts by burying all the dead with the rituals of Mor, who can prevent them from being raised if his rites are properly performed, and that would reduce all of the battlefield dead to 0. So if the vampire counts were to attack your empire, and you had performed this liturgy, they would have nothing to raise. So the vampire counts would not be able to constantly increase their armies and replenish their dead when they invade your realm. They'd have to retreat, replenish, and then come back, which could make for a much more interesting push and pull series of battles between the vampire counts and the Empire. The next liturgy I'd be looking at is the Liturgy of Tal and Raya, though I think it could very easily be exchanged for Shalya. So Tal and Raya are the goddess of nature and life, essentially. Raya being more of like the life side of things with like fertility and bountiful harvests and home and hearth, while Tal is more of like the forests and nature and all those aspects. Shalya is the goddess of healing and mercy, and she would easily move in for this as well, though you'd have to tweak it a little bit. So for Tal and Raya, what I would say is that because they should provide the following bonuses: increased growth in all owned areas, increased replenishment rates for all armies, and increased campaign movement in home provinces. And the way I see that working is that the increased growth would essentially come from the bountiful harvests and all the blessings of Raya to make sure that, babies are delivered well and healthy and the fields are producing lots of crops. I'd say increased replenishment rates, because obviously there'd be a surplus of food, and Tal would also allow hunters to more easily locate prey and such to have more supplies and bountiful life within the Empire. And then the campaign movement would represent that Tal, who is the god of the forest, would basically allow Imperial soldiers carrying his blessing to more easily discover secret paths through the forest that allows them to move faster and safer, avoiding ambushing forest goblins or beastmen and such, and basically avoid the true dangers of the forest and pass through quickly and unhindered. And that's, but obviously that would only work in regions you own. That way, if you're trying to pass through the realms that the Beastmen have destroyed, Tal has no authority there. But I thought that would be a really cool way to represent those two. The next one I have is the Liturgy of Ranald. So Ranald is the god of thieves, merchants, and luck. And essentially, he tends to represent kind of underhanded dealings, gambling, all matters related to luck is very much in his aspect. So the way I thought he would be best represented is if he increased agent success chance, decreased enemy agent success chance, maybe increased income to represent the gambling and the merchants doing well and all that such, and then increasing all of your army's chances to find magic items. So that would be kind of a cool way to represent him, just increasing the luck overall for your various agents and armies with the, find magic item chance and agents and stuff. And then the income could represent his benefiting your empire through merchants and stuff by blessing them with good trade, good fortune, and the ability to come across a good amount of coin. I wouldn't have it be super substantial, maybe plus 10% from local income buildings or something like that. And the last one I have, the fourth rite, is the Liturgy of Ulrich. Ulrich, of course, is the god of battle, wolves, and winter. He's the god that Sigmar worshipped when he was alive, and much like Sigmar, when roused to war, he is a very powerful patron. For his skills, when activated, I would recommend the following. I would have him basically give experience to all armies, so 100 experience at the end of each turn or whatever. Increase the recruitment rank of all new troops. Increase lord rank for newly recruited lords. And then I would do one of the following. I would either have him unleash winter storms that cause attrition to enemy armies in allied territory, or I would have him provide an army ability called the White Wolves of Ulrich. And what I would have that be is one of three things. Either it should be like an explosion of blue flame that allows for like pretty substantial damage and does like a chilling aura so that it slows people to represent like the blue flames of Ulrich and all their cold iciness. Or it could be the Gana's Golden Hounds vortex spell, which is where you place down a vortex and it has a bunch of dogs like jumping back and forth. Orion has a version of that as well with his hounds. So it could be that, but it provides a chilling aura to people hit. The final option, which I think would be the most fun, would be if Ulrich's army ability like summoned a unit of ice wolves on the battlefield, much like how the Lizardmen can summon feral cold ones, or the Skaven can summon clan rats. And that would be like a really cool unit to be able to throw down that would allow you to chase down enemy units and slow them and stuff like that. So that's it for the rights, and this actually concludes the pure free LC section. So the next section we're going to move on to is the thoughts on possible future free LC and DLC section, which is going to be like adding completely new content to the game. So buckle up and let's go ahead and dive into the next section. For the next thing we're going to be looking at is when it comes to DLC and free LC, I'm going to be talking about adding new legendary lords. Now, obviously, we did talk about old Boris Todbringer earlier on in the video, but he's a little bit easier to implement, so I considered him part of the true free LC section. These are more for characters who would kind of basically have to be built from scratch. So, you know, that's why they're kind of in this separate area. So let's go ahead and get started. The first one, who I guess nominate for creation, is Marius Leitdorf. So there aren't many characters who are as characterful as the Mad Count of Averland. Beyond infamous for his somewhat unhinged mind, he's considered one of the greatest tactical geniuses the Empire has had to lead it into battle. Moreover, he was incredibly paranoid and thus heavily invested in the defense of Averheim, making it into one of the most formidable fortresses in the Empire, which kind of plays into the Averberg that we talked about earlier. When it comes to unique items, Leitdorf has his weapon loadout of wielding the Averland Runefang alongside a long dagger to accent his style as an expert duelist. The easiest way to interpret this would probably just to make him, you know, an expert duelist lord, or a character who, if you've not ever played with any of the duelist lords in Total War, they basically have a narrower cleave with their attacks, but they do more damage. So they're much better at dealing with like individual characters and stuff like that. As for the Runefang itself, like all of its kin, it should just dramatically increase his armor piercing while active. And if it did need to have a unique nature, like how Karl Franz's Runefang has a unique ability in Boris Todbringer's, what I would say is it should increase Marius's melee attack when active to represent the nature of it. And his particular Runefang, the Averland Runefang, is known as Mother's Ruin. As for special abilities, Marius has a rule in tabletop called the Mad Count, which gives him a various assortment of effects. Some of them are buffs, some of them are debuffs, depending on what he rolls. I think the best way to implement this would be to split it into two portions. The first would be to give him the Outrageous Insult ability, which he's super famous for. That would give, if he used it, it would give an enemy character a buff to their melee attack and or weapon strength, but would cause them to enrage for a duration. So essentially you'd be able to force an enemy character to enrage, however they would get better at fighting because they're so pissed off by what you said about their mother. The second would be to give Marius a passive either called Insane Bravado or Berserk Rage, both of which are from also his Mad Count ability, that would result in him gaining a buff similar to Frenzy, but it only activates once his leadership is below 50%, to simulate him losing control over his madness. So I think the idea behind that is it would be kind of a unique gimmick, whereas Frenzy in Total War right now works as something that you have it until you reach 50% leadership and then you lose it. It'd be funny and interesting, I think, if Marius instead did not have it until he reached 50% leadership and then he got his buffs. There are some characters who have a similar system, like I think it's Belagar, Ironhammer. I know Thorgrim does, but a couple of characters in the game have abilities where if they get to 50% leadership or health, they get a buff. So for Marius, I would just have it be like a pretty notable damage buff to represent him kind of losing control and just getting super angry and going crazy. When it comes to his mounts, I would have Marius actually I would not give him the Griffin option. I would keep him pretty restricted to the ground. So I would either have him only have a foot option or his armored warhorse who is named Daisy, or Daisy Kurt von Hellboring II, who is an advisor of his, because, you know, he's crazy. Just because I don't think every character in the game needs to have epic monstrous mounts. I think it's good to have a spectrum, especially since pretty much whenever you offer player them those, you know, super powerful monstrous characters, they're pretty much always going to take them, and you lose a little bit of like the flair that you can get between having lords with a sword and mounts who, you know, aren't always going to be on the Griffin. It'd be nice to just see someone who has like just the Barded Warhorse as their highest option for a combat lord. As for the rest of his stuff, his start position would obviously be in Aberheim, the capital of Averland. For faction effects, I would give him -10 diplomacy with pretty much every faction in the game, seeing as he's very infamous for insulting others. In fact, he's so infamous for being kind of a dick that most courts do not allow him in the Empire, especially if there are women in the court, because he's infamous for not keeping his hands to himself. The exception I would have being Reichland should be the only faction that doesn't have a diplomatic debuff with him, because Karl Franz actually respects Marius Liebdorf and actually cares for him as a friend. His other faction effect should be -10% construction cost for garrison buildings, faction-wide, to represent, you know, his paranoia, and in his defensive focus, and like especially if you read like the end times, Marius went crazy turning the Averberg into a fortress. Much like it was already a pretty powerful fortress, but he turned it into something spectacular. And the other side of that paranoia would be to give him a +20% to spotting enemy armies, which I think would be a good way to represent him being kind of a tactical wizard and being able to identify when enemies are nearby, and also allowing him to not be ambushed as easily. For his lord effects, I would simply give him a leadership aura of +10%, or +10% to his leadership aura in size, and then add +4 to the leadership aspect of his leadership aura, just to represent him being, you know, a brilliant general. The next option we're going to be looking at for a potential legendary lord is Marcus Wolfhart. Hunts Marshal of the Empire, Marcus is easily the greatest monster killer the Empire has known in quite some time. Already in his life, he's slain the Doomfire Dragon Malithrax, a Chimera, a Bone Grinder Giant, an Ice Dragon, and many more. For being essentially a man with just a magic bow, this is pretty damn impressive, and he would make a really interesting lord who's very different from anything else the Empire has to offer. As for how he would be implemented, I would definitely just have him be a ranged lord who has a very powerful anti-large shooting attack with a major amount of armor piercing. In addition, he does come with immune to psychology, which is always a nice bonus to have on your lords. When it comes to magic items, the only one Marcus has is the aptly named Amber Bow, which was crafted and enchanted to slay even the mightiest of monsters. There are a couple different ways this could be implemented. One could be that when the Amber Bow is equipped, it would be able to fire a series of those like big bolt arrows like the Arrow of Karnos does, where it shoots like 3 items that go flying through the air and hits people. Or it could be more like the Amber Spear, where it just fires a single shot that hones in on a monster that you choose, and it just does a bunch of damage. Or finally, it could just be an active buff, kind of like most weapons are in the game right now, like, you know, Gitsnik and the Ancestral Grudge for Belagar. That would just drastically buff his reload skill, accuracy, and potentially his range damage. For a unique skill, the thing I would give Marcus should be a passive ability called Monster Hunter. Just like it works in tabletop, what this essentially should do is give an AoE buff to all nearby ranged units within like 30 or 40 meters of Marcus, and give them a notable buff to their shooting attack. The best way to implement that would just to have it increase either their accuracy or reload skill, and then give a notable anti-large bonus, like, you know, plus 10, plus 20. Or the other way Monster Hunter could work is it could be a debuff that you are able to use only on monstrous units that like maybe reduces their missile resistance and speed. But I think the better way to do it would be able to allow Marcus to, well, actually either way would work. It just depends on how you want to implement it. While Marcus is definitely not a slouch in combat, I would actually have him also have an anti-large bonus in melee as well as range, though his melee skill should not be as good. And the reason for that would be that tabletop, Marcus Wolfheart has hatred against monsters, which allows him to be much better at fighting monsters in close combat. So the best way to carry that over would to also give him anti-large in close combat. But the downside would be that despite the fact that he's not terrible in close combat, he's definitely worse than all of the other legendary lords except for maybe Gelt, if he's isolated. On top of that, I would give him the Vanguard special rule, though personally I think it would be better to give him Stalk to represent that he's a scout, because, you know, he's the captain of scouts for the Empire, and having a Stalk ranged lord who specializes in anti-large could be really neat for the Empire. The Stalk isn't necessary, because CA seems to be kind of avoiding giving legendary lords Stalk when they can, but I do think it would be a nice buff. As for his mounts, the only mounts I would give him would be on foot and then horse options. I would not give him a Pegasus or anything larger. For start position, I would put Marcus Wolfheart in Wolfenburg, as he tends to hang out in the heavily forested areas of the Empire and lands to the north where he can find all the terrible monsters that he hunts. Though you could put him in Hergig, that also wouldn't be too bad. For faction effects, I would say to give him a minus 20% upkeep for Huntsmen, which we'll talk about in a minute, or alternatively minus 25% upkeep for ranged infantry units. And then I would give him plus 5% speed for all units in the entire faction, just to give, you know, just a note that they're all a little speedier. As for his Lord effects, I would give all units in Wolfheart's army the Vanguard special rule to represent that, you know, he's a Scoutmaster. And I would give plus 20% ammunition to all the ranged units in his army, which could add a nice incentive to play around his whole concept of being a ranged character, which we need more of. You know, like the Wood Elves, you know, kind of have Orion as a range-ish character, but we could definitely use some more like range-focused legendary lords. The final legendary lord potentiate we'll be looking at is Kurt Helborg. Reichsmarshal of the Empire, Helborg is credited as the best fighter currently alive in the greatest nation of men. He is the captain of the Reichsguard and has proven himself a brilliant commander and fought the world over in the name of the Emperor. He's literally fought on almost every continent. He's fought in many countries, though, to say the least. So for magic items, Helborg relies on two. The first is the Solend Runefang, known as Grudge Settler, which, just like all other Runefangs, when activated, it should provide Helborg with a massive bonus to his armor piercing, weapon strength, and splash damage. The Solend Runefang isn't known for having any particularly super interesting effect. However, because Helborg's wielding it, I would have it where Karl Franz's Runefang focuses on buffs to like nearby infantry, and Marius Leitdorf's would probably be more of like increasing his chance to hit as a duelist, and then Boris Todbringer's currently gives him regeneration. I would have Helborg's Runefang just massively increase his splash damage and weapon strength to represent his just badassery as the ultimate fighter in the Empire, and being able to just lead the Reichsguard in like a super epic charge. His second magic item, however, is a much more interesting thing called the Laurels of Victory. So these laurels that he wears were crafted and enchanted by the Shadow Wizards of the Grey College, and what they do is they make Helborg appear as a looming figure brimming with power to any foe that looks upon him. I think the best way to implement this item would just be a passive ability that whenever Helborg is in close combat, he reduces the leadership of nearby enemies by -4 to -8, depending on how powerful you want to make them. So it'd be kind of like the Fey Enchantress's ability, where she, has the Mist of the Ladies when she's in close combat, but instead would be just a leadership debuff to everyone within 30 meters of him when he's fighting in close combat. I think that'd be a really nice way to encourage players to keep him in the fight. And it would also make him very dangerous at leading other Reiksguard units, because getting in those big charges that do a lot of leadership damage when you hit from the rear or whatnot, having an additional leadership debuff due to the Laurels of Victory would be an awesome combo. When it comes to special abilities, the only one that Helborg really has of note is that he's immune to psychology, which is always a very popular plus. A lot of people really love immune to psych characters. His other ability, which is the Emperor's Chosen, would probably be better implemented on his skill tree as opposed to being a passive or anything. And if it were on his skill tree, I would just have it be a massive buff. If he unlocks it, would be a massive buff to Reiksguard and grant them all Reiksguard in his army the immune to psychology special rule. For faction effects, I would have Kurt Helborg have -20% upkeep on all knight units to represent his goal as his position as the Reichsmarshal. I would also have him give +20 charge to all knight units, and finally, as a representative, as kind of the best warrior of the Empire and drawing those kinds of people to him, I would have him give +5 melee, +5-ish melee attack and defense for embedded heroes in armies, or at least his army. Now, I should note that all these changes are not me saying that this is what it needs to be. I'm just tossing out ideas. It could be something completely different. I'm just feeding ideas into the fire. For his Lord effects, I would say -25% attrition due to frozen or desert terrain to, represent the idea of him traveling the world over to take the fight to the enemies of the Empire, and also to kind of, give a nod to that. And it would allow him he would kind of be the lord that would encourage you to go out and take the fight to Araby or the Tomb Kings or the Norskins and not be punished as much. He can even be immune to those attritions if you wanted to go extra hard. I would also have his lord effect be I would give him in addition -15% recruitment cost for Reiksguard and -10% construction cost for knight buildings, including chapter houses for unique knights. Hopefully you'll think that's a good idea. So that's it for the Legendary Lords. So let's go ahead and move on to the section that I feel much more comfortable about, because Legendary Lords do require a lot of work. These guys I don't think require necessarily as much, and I think they could really change the game, which is generic stuff. So let's go ahead and now hop into that. So moving into the more generic characters, let's start with a new Lord. When it comes to a new generic Lord, I think the most welcome addition that would be extremely interesting would be adding the Grand Masters. So each of these guys are essentially badass heroes in the modern age. They're leaders of the various knightly orders and chapters to be found across the Empire, and they make extremely good generals, though they are a little bit more focused on combat and skill in warfare compared to the generals, who tend to be better leaders. So what makes them really different? Well, the first is that the Grandmaster has a much better stat line. They tend to be better at dealing more damage and would probably have much higher armor piercing rates, while relying on their notably higher melee defense and armor to protect them. In addition, one thing that's really nice about Grandmasters is that all of them have the immune to psychology trait, which is, always popular. When it comes to their skill tree, I would have their uniqueness like their unique tree, kind of like how the Tomb Kings can select a god, or the Norse can select a patron, or the Dark Elves can select, well, most of them are god related, aren't they? But in any event, for what I would do for the Grand Master is have them choose a different knightly order to be from. And depending on which knightly order they choose to be the Grand Master of, and it could just be like, 3 to 5 of the most famous ones, they would get various buffs that would allow them to be customized in interesting ways. I would give them a yellow tree, which is notably stronger than the ones the generals have. And in their red tree, I would give them a unique ability that allows them to grant cavalry in their army the immune to psychology skill, or maybe just knight units in their army. And they should focus much more on combat buffs than leadership buffs, using their red tree. To truly set the Grandmasters apart, however, I would have them always automatically come on a Barded Warhorse, so you should not even be able to take them on foot. And they should have the horse, the Barded War, or maybe just the Barded Warhorse, and then their elite mount should be the Demigryph. And giving them the Demigryph as an elite mount would allow for a really powerful, armor-piercing badass of a lord, who, whether or not you wanted to give him, he could be an anti-large lord. I mean, it would kind of work with him having like a lance and being like someone that's good at fighting monsters. I don't know if he would really be the best place for that, but if you were going to do it, this would be the place, this would be the character to do it. And the Empire could certainly use a armor-piercing, anti-large, badass. But the Demigryph would make for a really nice elite mount and would allow him to synergize really well with those really powerful cav units. And it's also lore-friendly, because each of the Demigryph knightly orders does have a Grand Master. And so that's pretty much it for him. Another lord type obviously would be the Wizard Lord. I'm not going to wax too much on that, but just having more wizard options is never a bad idea. Giving players the ability to take a caster lord and then focus more on like their army without having to because it allows for a different play. If you allow people to take a casting lord instead of having to do it as a hero, then you open up some really interesting plays, because you can save a lot of value with a casting lord. Maybe you buy a Lord of Fire as your Lord for the Empire, which then allows you to basically avoid having to buy a fighter hero and a wizard, so you save money, and in addition, you can either buy like fighting heroes, or you can just focus on essentially taking more troops. But it allows for different kinds of play, which I always find interesting. You could even have the Wizard Lords be characters, or the lords that are missing, maybe. Like maybe the Death Wizard could be a lord instead of a hero. When it comes to a new hero choice, speaking of which, my recommendation to enjoy the impressive ranks of the Empire would be the Master Engineer. Though I would recommend we call him just the Engineer. That way the dwarves have the Master Engineer and the humans have the Engineer, so you're less likely to get confused. Typically odd fellows armed with a motley mix of dangerous inventions, these individuals bring the true power behind the gunpowder aspect that Magnus the Pious once boasted of. The Empire really could use a character who kind of ups their shooting ability, and war machines for that matter, to the next level. Because right now the Empire does have access to numerous black powder units and war machines and steam tank and stuff, but it doesn't really have a hero or lord, in this case hero, that complements that playstyle very well at the moment. So when we look at the Engineer, I would recommend the following things. For his shooting attack, which is obviously what he would focus more heavily on, you could either give him the Hochland Long Rifle, which is a pretty famous weapon that it would be nice to see nodded to, that would allow him to basically have, a snipe attack that's very powerful, just a single target, longer reload time, but it allows him to just ping a lord for a really nice burst of armor-piercing damage. Or you could give him a repeater handgun, which would not be quite as long range or snipe heavy, but it would shoot faster. Obviously, he should have the extra powder and ballistics calibrations special rule, and I would also give him the ability to shoot an explosive and to represent either the very, very infamous pigeon bomb that they had, which is literally a pigeon that the Imperials engineers would strap a bomb to, and they would like let the pigeon go and like try and get it to fly into an enemy unit and explode. Or it could represent his grenade launching blunderbuss, which was a really powerful tool. Obviously, that's kind of represented right now with the Outriders. But either of those could be cool. Like, you know, an ability he has 3 charges on. He like clicks it and clicks on a unit and he fires an explosive at them, which would be really nice. Especially if it, you know, did really nice explosion damage. It'd just be a good way to like clear out a horde, or if the enemy got all congested, you could do some good damage. For his mount, I would just give him on foot or on a horse. If the guys at CA had some free time, which they probably certainly don't, or an intern who wanted to really show off their skill, then giving the engineer a mechanical steed, which is a unique mount they had in Tabletop, which is literally like a clockwork horse. That would be so badass, but that would be a lot of extra work for just a hero. And obviously having the Death and Metal Wizard would be super nice, just to give the Empire the full 8 would be so nice. I know the Death Wizard is probably too overpowered to give to the Empire, especially with the current state of the Witch Hunters, because Accusation is basically Spirit Leech that just doesn't cost magic. And I feel like if they were to have Witch Hunters and Death Wizards, it can maybe get a little bit much, but that would also be a lot of point investment. So that concludes the hero section, and now we're going to ease our way into the new unit section. And keep in mind, these are all DLC ideas. So this is when I talk about the Grandmasters and the Wizards and stuff, and the 3 proposed Legendary Lords. These are people I'm talking about purchasing. So this would be like if CA really wanted to impress us and do another DLC of like, you know, the Empire versus Greenskins DLC that, you know, featured Marius Leetdorf and, I don't know, Grom the Paunch or Gorbad Ironclaw. But, you know, something like that, just so you kind of know where I'm coming with. But these I'm not recommending that CA do for us for free. I'm recommending we pay for these. So the first unit that I would like to see added is the Huntsman. Right now, it's not a big secret that the Empire struggles with large monsters that simply walk around the battlefield, especially kind of, you know, your heavily armored dinosaurs and such, because the Empire just doesn't have a lot of anti-large options to easily counter them. And this would not be easy, but it would at least give them an option. So the thing I would recommend would be the Huntsman. Skilled hunters and scouts, these men often hail from the wilder lands of the Empire, such as Ostland, Stirling, and Ostermark. For their rules, I would recommend the following. They should be vanguarding, skirmishing infantry. So skirmish formation, so kind of that wider formation you see with like Way Watchers and Deepwood Scouts. They should have stalk, 360 shooting, move while firing, and then for their actual damage, they should have low armor piercing values, but a very high anti-large bonus, because the Huntsmen were very much associated with Marcus Wolfhard and could be upgraded with some of his skills to make them really good at hunting monsters. And they were actually just, quite frankly, pretty damn good at it in Tabletop. They weren't good against, you know, heavily armored monsters like dragons, but they were very good against, like, giants and other things like that. So having them have the ability to essentially continue that role would give the Empire some more options, especially as a vanguarding stalking shooting unit that could put the hurt on cav units and start at least damaging those big monsters as they're coming down the field. Would just be a nice form of variety. The next unit we'll be looking at are basic archers. Quite frankly, I'm not sold on these guys. I've just put them in the list because they'd be easy to do and they're technically part of the Imperial roster. But basically my only recommendation for them would be a very, very cheap archer unit that's shorter range than crossbows and does less damage, but maybe has more guys. And I would just make them dirt cheap. I don't know if the Empire really needs them, probably not, but, you know, it would add for more variety, and it would probably give the Empire a better unit against hordes, especially if they were looking for something very cheap. Forgive the odds. So now we get into probably the ones that people would find the most exciting. The next unit I'm going to be looking at are the Knights Panther. So in the Empire, there are 3 knightly orders that are noted to be the greatest and most important, is probably the best way to say it, at least according to 8th edition. And we already have one of them in the game, as the Knights of the Blazing Sun, so we're going to go ahead and look at the other two. So the Knights Panther are an exemplar order that represents everything it is to be knightly. Wearing the pelts of great cats and other outlandish beasts they have slain in battle, there are none who pursue chaos worshippers, mutants, and beastmen like these brave souls. With a notable habit of topping their helms with beastman head-styled crests, they will take any chance to pursue the great and many horrid monsters that plague the land. As such, their rules could be the following. It actually would also be very convenient to add these guys, as the Knights Panther chapter house is already a unique building in Caroburg, so it's already there. You don't even have to do any work there. And quite frankly, the way I would have these guys be is a powerful heavy cav unit, very similar to the Knights of the Blazing Sun and the Reichsguard, except for I would give them the immune to psychology rule and give them just anti-large. Just make them the monster hunting knight unit. So just a nice heavy cav with a really solid anti-large bonus that makes them essentially a more numerous version of the Demigryph Knights with halberds, with, you know, obviously a different stat line. So they're not quite as good, well, probably not nearly as good, but there's more of them. Whether or not they should have immune to psychology is kind of up in the air. Like, it sounds like it would make sense because they're used to hunting chaos and mutants and all sorts of other nasty things, but that might be too much, so maybe I probably would not recommend the immune to psych. Then we have the Knights of the White Wolf. So we talked about these guys quite a bit earlier because I think if they decided to make Boris Todbringer playable as free LC, the best unit to package with him would be the Knights of the White Wolf. So the final and greatest knightly order missing from the Total War Warhammer rosters, the Knights of the White Wolf. A rather unorthodox knightly order. They refuse to wear helmets, and because they want to have all of their long hair and their beards whipping about in the wind as they scream, running into battle. And they wield these massive two-handed great hammers that they use to smash the skulls of their foe, as opposed to riding, with lances or swords. Nah, they prefer those nice big blunt hammers. And with their badass wolf pelts, the white wolf pelts, these guys would be pretty epic looking charging into battle, just like kind of the Knights of the Blazing Sun are now. As for how they would play, they would be a powerful heavy cav. They would be very similar to the questing knights. They would have incredibly high armor piercing, but they would have lower armor and lower melee defense due to the fact they have no shields, no helmets, and obviously they're wielding great weapons, so they're not, as skillful when it comes to defense. So it'd be nice to see these guys kind of be a high, obviously high armor, but lower armor, lower melee defense than their other knightly order brothers, but higher, just massive amounts of armor piercing damage as they put those great hammers to good use. So with that, we are on to the final unit, and probably the most difficult to implement. This is who I call the heavy hitter, as I think he would take the most work, though probably not a ton, but I think he would actually provide a really nice series of options to the Imperial roster, and that is the Celestial Hurricanum. So for those of you that don't know, the the laser beam chariot, whose name I'm forgetting right now, that you can already get with the Empire, has a cousin. It's built the exact same way, but instead of being a giant series of mirrors on a chariot, it's instead a kind of those solar system projects that kids make in elementary school, where you just have a series of the planets connected by little rods. It's basically that, but on the back of a chariot and really big. And so what it does is it's a creation made by the Celestial College that channels the winds of Azir, or heavens, to basically unleash storms upon the enemy. And it also provides the benefits of celestial magic to soldiers fighting nearby. So what would it do? It would have 3 abilities, 2 of which are passives. The first would be the Locus of Azir. So just like how the Lumen Ark, that's what it's called. So the Lumen Ark of Hysh currently has the Locus of Hysh, which right now does that, depending on the number of enemy units within range, reduces the enemy's Winds of Magic. The Locus of Azir does the exact opposite. So it kind of functions like the Lich Priests. They have an item right now in multiplayer called Nefara's Scrolls of Mighty Incantation, and it would basically do the exact same thing, though probably not to the same extent. So the Locus of Azir basically would be that the more allied units are within like a 40-meter radius, the more it increases the Winds of Magic available to the Empire player. So it basically encourages you to kind of keep all your guys together if you're playing a magic-heavy build, as it provides more Winds of Magic if you have enough troops within range. Obviously, it wouldn't be as much of a buff as Nefara's Mighty Scrolls of Incantations provides, because it's constantly going, but it would still be a nice buff, and if you're, playing like Gelt, or you just have a hero-reliant build, it would just be a good way to kind of give you a constant buff to your Winds of Magic without going too crazy. The second passive it has, which I think would be incredibly popular with the Empire, is the Portents of Battle. Just like we talked about with the Locuses, this is the offense ability to counter the defense ability of the Lumen Ark. So whereas the Lumen Ark has the Aura of Protection, which we talked about earlier, that I recommend should change a little bit, but it provides defensive buffs, the Portents of Battle should increase the melee attack of all friendly units within like 40 meters. And it shouldn't be something crazy, it should be something like +4 melee attack to all friendly units within 40 meters. +6 or something. Enough that it can make a difference, especially since it's just kind of a constant buff and it has enough of a big radius, but not enough that, it just completely makes the Empire OP. But I think that would make it a really nice buff wagon, which the Lumen Ark should be as well. But, this one's more probably would be a little bit more popular due to providing buffs to the player in more tangible ways that they have more control over. Where the Lumen Ark is reducing enemy Winds of Magic and increasing your defense, those are kind of buffs that you don't have control over, whereas increasing your melee attack and your Winds of Magic gives you more control. By throwing yourself with those higher melee attacks, it can help you choose better engagements and such. Now, here's the tricky part of the Celestial Hurricanum. Its spell ability, the Lumen Ark shoots giant laser beams. That's its spell ability from tabletop, which they interpreted as a shooting attack, which was kind of cool. The Lumen Ark, however, has a much more complicated ability called the Storm of Shimtek. So basically the way this thing works is where the Lumen Ark shoots a laser beam, the Hurricanum would summon a storm that had a completely random effect. So the way to handle this, in my opinion, would be to I would keep it much like the Lumen Ark, in that it doesn't actually cast magic, but instead would use bound spells. Because I think keeping the motif of it being the opposite of the Lumen Ark is important to the identity of the two units and making them very interesting and dynamic. So whereas the Lumen Ark relies on a shooting attack, I would have the Celestial Hurricanum rely on magical bound spell attacks to represent the storms. So I think the best way to represent these storms summoned by the Wind of Heavens would just be to use Wind of Heavens spells. So for this particular battle wagon, I would give it probably 2 spells. I would probably give it like Wind Blast and Chain Lightning. Or, maybe you could give it Urian's Thunderbolt and Wind Blast, or Urian's Thunderbolt and Comet. But I would just pick 2 spells from the Wind of Heavens, and I would have a smaller spell like Urian's Thunderbolt or Wind Blast where you get 3 charges, and then a bigger spell like Chain Lightning or Comet where you get 2 casts. And basically these would just be nice damage spells that would allow it to just, do some damage and give you the feeling of summoning storms upon the battlefield. Now, of course, if someone wanted to elaborate and create a new ability for it, a new spell for it, that would be perfectly awesome too. Like if you played the Norska campaign, the Dragon Ogres in that have a unique ability where they can summon like this big old storm around themselves. Like if the Lumen Ark could do, or not the Lumen Ark, if the Hurricanum could do that like once or twice per battle, that would be pretty badass. However, in keeping with the motif we talked about earlier, being the Lumen Ark's polar opposite, I would have the Hurricanum focus on AoE abilities as well. So while the Lumen Ark of Hysh is a sniping, shooty thing that, you know, shoots a single powerful bolt a couple times that just eradicates a single target, it'd be nice to have the Celestial Hurricanum instead have a couple of spells that it's able to unleash that focus on destroying large blobs of enemies, just so that the two remain, you know, very distinct and different. And with that, we have reached the end of my list in a whopping 2-hour video. Oh my god. So, I will be, if you're watching the end of this, it's kind of pointless for me to say this now, but there are going to be timestamps for this one. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you watched all in one sitting, then congrats to you, but I imagine most of you are hopefully going to watch it in multiple sittings. Once again, the point of this video is not for me to say, this is what we should do, and everyone should agree with me and go tell CA to get off their asses and do it. That's not the point of this video. The point of this video is just to open a dialogue, focusing on one faction at a time, and talk about interesting ways that they could be developed, added to, improved upon, etc., etc. But the main point is just to start brainstorming, and just to get the community focused on an idea or a perspective and allow them to start throwing out ideas and to get, hopefully, CA's attention and just help give them some ideas. The goal here is not to have anything from this list implemented into the game. The goal for this video is to inspire something to be added into the game. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to hit that like button. If you're new here and want to see more content like this, please consider hit that subscribe button. Sorry, I'm getting tired now. And we have another faction coming up soon. I would actually appreciate it if you made it this far, if you would list down in the comment section what faction we should do next. I'm thinking either Wood Elves or Greenskins, probably Greenskins, but like if I see an overwhelming support for a different faction, we might go a different way. So let me know your thoughts, your ideas, your interests, what you guys think of this video. Like, do you agree with it? Do you disagree with it? Do some of the ideas speak out to you? Does one of them sound cool? Why does it sound cool? Do you disagree with something? Why? So, thanks again for watching, guys. I'll see you guys around. Take care of yourselves. This is Loremaster of Sotek signing off. Have a good night, guys. Bye.